Chapter 3306, Chapter 380, Demigod. Chapter 3306, Chapter 380, Demigod. Chapter 380, Demigod TL notes. Made a change to Chapter 380, Origina. Meanwhile, as soon as these flying mounts crossed the 10,000-yard mark, each flying mount came face to face with over 1,000 void sea serpents and several dozen void sea dragons. Trecht and the other paragons could feel their scalps tingling when they saw how many enemies they had to go up against. It was especially so when they saw how many void sea dragons stood in their way. Changed to, meanwhile, as soon as these flying mounts crossed the 10,000-yard mark, a significantly greater number of monsters moved to hinder their advance. Among them, the mutated Frostflame Phantom Dragon had to deal with over 1,000 void sea serpents and several dozen void sea dragons simultaneously. Trecht and the other paragons felt their scalps tingling when they saw this scene. It was especially so when they saw the grouping of void sea dragons. Impossible. Who is she? Whether it was Trecht and the other Tier 4 paragons or the 4 beast warriors, they couldn't help but be dumbfounded when they saw the several dozen void sea dragons blocking Zero Wing's team falling into the void sea. They were so shocked by this scene that they had nearly forgotten to defend themselves against the void sea dragons they faced. Meanwhile, standing atop the Frostflame Dragon's back, Midsummer couldn't help but turn to look at Shifeng and ask, "Who is this person, guild leader?" Even Trecht, an existence on par with Empress Blood Arrow and the undefeated Battle Maniac, had great difficulty going up against 3 void sea dragons by himself. If he tried to take on several dozen void sea dragons by himself, he would instantly be reduced to ashes. After all of the void sea dragons could attack from range. If several dozen of them attacked, there'd be no room for him to make evasive maneuvers. Yet, the woman named Laura Crader had heavily damaged several dozen void sea dragons in one move. Her strength was utterly horrifying. Xiao, has Zero Wing always had such an expert? Jun Luosha asked, the corner of her eyes twitching as she looked at Wu Xiao. The degree of shock she experienced from seeing what just happened was beyond the shock she experienced from learning about Shifeng's ownership of a legendary flying mount. At this time, Jun Luosha could only think of one word to describe the woman known as Laura Crader. Invincible. True invincibility. Dira's 4 bodyguards had to work together just to hold back a dozen or so void sea dragons from attacking Dira. Moreover, that was under the condition that all 4 of them had reached Tier 5. It should be known that the 4 beast warriors were not some random nobodies. They were paragons nurtured by the Paimon conglomerate for many years. During their early years, their names were known throughout the Starlight Realm, and the fame they enjoyed back then went far beyond what paragons like Trecht currently enjoyed. But now, comparing the 4 beast warriors to Laura Crader felt like comparing the glow of 4 fireflies with the glow of a full moon. With an expert like Laura Crader defending Zero Wing, the guild's position in the miniature ancient world would be unshakable. Did Zero Wing have such an expert? Wu Xiao did not have an answer to Jun Luosha's question. This was because she was equally shocked and confused by this situation. She never knew Zero Wing had an expert of Laura's caliber under its command. The reason behind Wu Xiaoxiao's confidence in inviting Jun Luosha to join Zero Wing was because of Shifeng and the 100 Refinement Building in Gazing Moon City. Meanwhile, like Jun Luosha, this was the first time Wu Xiaoxiao was meeting with the person known as Laura Crader. While everyone was immersed in shock and confusion, Shifeng steered the Frostflame Dragon to the floating island. In only a few seconds, the Frostflame Dragon overtook Dira's party of 5. Meanwhile, every void sea dragon that tried to hinder the Frostflame Dragon's advance was struck down without fail by Laura's sword. Damn it! Dira cursed when he saw that Zero Wing's team had moved within 1,000 yards of the floating island. Then, he turned to Platinum Behemoth and asked, "Platinum, what is that person's standard?" Tier 6. Platinum Behemoth said, a hint of fear surfacing in his eyes as he looked at the distant Laura Crader. Her strike just now has already reached the entry level of the Tier 6 standard. The entry level of Tier 6? Surprised, Dira exclaimed, "Doesn't that mean she's already on par with White Owl?" "Most likely." Platinum Behemoth nodded. "If we have to compete against her for the legacy, we have 0 chances of winning. White Owl was one of the Paimon conglomerate's current 10 core paragons. Not only did she receive a fragmented legendary equipment set from the conglomerate, but she was even assigned a legendary weapon of high compatibility. Recently, she had even successfully constructed a Tier 5 epic mana body, becoming a candidate for the conglomerate's 3 overlords position in the future. At the same time, White Owl was also responsible for commanding the Tier 4 army that would be invading the miniature ancient world to deal with Zero Wing. Moreover, because of a favor she owed to the Divine Seal Saint several years ago, she had agreed to complete her promotion to Tier 5 as soon as she entered the World Passage. Damn it. Contact White Owl and have her hurry over here, Dira said in dissatisfaction. It's all that damned Zero Wing's fault. Once White Owl's group arrives, I'll make sure Zero Wing suffers. The appearance of the Void God settlement in the miniature ancient world's World Passage was a huge surprise even for him. Originally, he had thought of monopolizing the Void Saint legacy, but that evidently wouldn't be possible now. When Platinum Behemoth had gone offline to contact White Owl, Zero Wing's team also arrived on the Void God's floating island. When Hidden Soul, who had only gotten promoted to Tier 4 recently, felt the eternal energy present on the island, she couldn't help but exclaim, "What an incredible place this is. Not only does it have such dense mana, but it even has eternal energy diffused across the air. This place will be wonderful for training." Gentle Snow, who had similarly reached Tier 4, excitedly nodded in agreement. Setting aside the solidified mana environment, just the eternal energy diffused in the air was enough to make it the dream training ground of countless players. Players seeking to train their skills, spells, and combat techniques could achieve incredible results here. Even players looking to create their Tier 5 mana body could receive great help from the environment here. This isn't a place for training, Shifeng said, shaking his head as he looked at the numerous void chains that covered the island. Not for training? Looking at Shifeng in confusion, Midsummer asked, wasn't it mentioned that the Void Saint legacy could be found here? The Void Saint legacy indeed exists here, Shifeng said. Then, he turned to look at a nearby town and explained, but this island itself is a space-time prison built specifically to imprison the greater gods' domain's demigods. Void gods constantly wandered the void, so most people knew very little about them. However, Shifeng happened to come across a piece of important information related to the void gods during his previous life. This information was also one of the greater gods' domain's great secrets. Imprison demigods. Do demigods need to be imprisoned? Existence capable of being regarded as a demigod in God's domain were NPCs who were only one step away from reaching Tier 6. However, there were plenty of such demigod-rank NPCs in the greater God's domain. There was also very little these demigod NPCs could accomplish in the greater God's domain, since even a country like the ancient River Kingdom had Tier 6 NPCs guarding it. It is naturally unnecessary to imprison ordinary demigods, Shifeng said before pausing for a short moment. Then, he continued, but what if it's a demigod who has destroyed a kingdom or an empire in the greater God's domain? What? A demigod who has destroyed a country in the greater God's domain? How is that even possible? Wu Xiaoxiao did not believe Shifeng's words for even a second. No matter how powerful a demigod was, they would still be nothing more than Tier 5 NPCs. Meanwhile, the greater God's domain was a place where many Tier 6 NPCs existed. There was no way a demigod could destroy an entire kingdom in the greater God's domain, much less an empire. However, in response to Wu Xiaoxiao's doubt, Shifeng simply chuckled and did not bother offering additional explanations. In God's domain, there were significant differences even between demigods. In fact, the difference could be even bigger than the gap between Tier 5 and Tier 6. If memory serves him correctly, it wouldn't be long before a piece of major news would shake the entire greater God's domain, the destruction of a realm caused by a demigod. While Shifeng and the others were making their way closer to the nearby village, a powerful voice suddenly echoed in everyone's minds, the voice instilling fear into everyone's souls. Humans. This is not a place for you to approach. System. You have discovered the settlement of void gods. You have triggered a legendary main storyline quest for the greater God's domain. Do you wish to accept the quest? If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., Please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. Chapter 3307, Chapter 381, Pseudo-Fifth Floor Expert. Chapter 3307, Chapter 381, Pseudo-Fifth Floor Expert. Chapter 381, Pseudo-Fifth Floor Expert. TL Notes. Made a change to Chapter 381, 10 Core Paragons - 10 Great Paragons. A legendary main storyline quest for the Greater Gods Domain. Everyone from Zero Wing subconsciously gulped when they saw the system notification they had just received. They did not know whether they should be smiling or crying over this situation. According to the information they gathered, legendary quests remained incredibly rare in the Greater Gods Domain. Most Tier 6 experts would only come across 1 or 2 legendary quests throughout their careers in God's Domain. As for legendary main storyline quests related to the Greater Gods Domain, their rarity was even higher, and most players in the Greater Gods Domain would spend their entire careers in God's Domain without ever seeing one. Meanwhile, so long as players could complete such a legendary main storyline quest, the resulting effects could affect the entire Greater Gods Domain. The rewards players could receive from completing such a quest would also be beyond their wildest imaginations. Though conversely, the penalty would be unbelievably harsh if they fail such a quest. Out of everyone present, Shifeng was the only person unfazed by the quest notification. After looking at the notification, he said through the team chat, "Anyone who wishes to attempt becoming a Void Saint can accept the quest. The system won't assign the actual quest to you until you become a Void Saint. So, if you fail the class change, the only penalty you'll receive is a prohibition from attempting the Void Saint class change in the future." The Void Saint class was different from his Sword Law Saint class in that it wasn't unique. There was no limit to the number of players who could become a Void Saint. However, every player would only ever have one opportunity to attempt to class change into a Void Saint. So long as they failed, they couldn't attempt the class change again, even if they started a new account. When Zero Wing's members heard Shifeng's explanation, they breathed a sigh of relief. At the same time, though, everyone couldn't help but be surprised by Shifeng's explanation. It was especially true for Laura Crader and the other members of the Glimmer Adventurer team. The details of becoming a Void Saint were a secret known by only those standing at the apex of the Greater Gods Domain. So, Laura and the others couldn't help but wonder how Shifeng, someone who supposedly lacked a powerful background, would know about this secret. Subsequently, everyone apart from Shifeng and Laura chose to accept the quest. Then, after everyone had made their decisions, a large phantom suddenly appeared in front of the town. The phantom was a 100-meter-tall giant that looked like someone had cut out a portion of a starry sky and shaped it into a person. The instant the phantom appeared, everyone present could feel a powerful divine might washing over them. The divine might was so powerful that even Shifeng and Laura found themselves completely immobilized. Void Phantom. God, Void Saint, level. HP. What a powerful doppelganger. It should be known that Laura was already a bona fide Tier 5, Sword Saint, whereas Shifeng might not have reached Tier 5 yet, but he was already strong enough to match Tier 5 players. In their current states, not even Tier 6 gods could immobilize them using only divine might. Yet, now, the two of them were rendered immobile by the divine might of a mere doppelganger. Humans. I've warned you, the Void Phantom coldly said. Since you insist on entering, be prepared to accept the consequences. As soon as the Void Phantom finished speaking, it made a grabbing gesture with its hand, instantly causing everyone except Shifeng and Laura to vanish into thin air. Then, the Void Phantom gradually dissipated and disappeared. Upon seeing this, Shifeng and Laura did not panic. They also didn't choose to leave their current location, opting to wait outside the town for the others to return. After all, there were dangers all over the island, and it would be difficult for most Tier 4 players to survive against the level 150+ Tier 5 legendary monsters that occupied the island. Hopefully, someone can succeed, Shifeng inwardly prayed as he looked at the town that was wrapped in void chains. It would be a huge jackpot for Zero Wing if anyone manages to become a Void Saint. Void Saints were known to be invincible among those of the same tier when fighting in the void. They could even transcend tiers. So, even at Tier 5, a Void Saint could be a formidable force. If Zero Wing could have a Void Saint on its side, it would have the qualifications to fight for a foothold in the void zones between realms. Those were places where upper-ranking hegemonic powers mainly operated. Time quickly passed, and 2 hours went by in the blink of an eye. At this time, a large group of players arrived a short distance away from the island. Among this group of players were Dira's party of 5 and paragons such as Trecht and Saint 9. However, out of this group of several dozen, Dira, surprisingly, wasn't the one standing in the lead. Instead, it was a short-haired woman wearing a suit of silver armor and a crown that had a sacred appearance. Upon closer observation, one would notice 2 other Tier 5 experts were standing next to this short-haired woman. Of these 2 Tier 5 experts, one was a middle-aged elven woman wielding a staff that looked like it was wrapped by lightning bolts, while the other was a 6-meter-tall middle-aged man with a muscular body and tanned skin. Both these 2 Tier 5 experts and the short-haired woman were at level 140, and all 3 of them were clad in equipment that could absolutely blind the eyes of all players in the miniature ancient world. All 3 of these players were clad in fragmented legendary equipment sets, with the short-haired woman's set being an 8-piece set and the other 2 sets being 6-piece sets. However, for the 2 with 6-piece sets, each of them was equipped with a piece of legendary equipment. Meanwhile, the auras these 3 players radiated were so powerful that ordinary Tier 4 players would have difficulty breathing in their presence. This place can make for an excellent training ground. It's a pity that Saint Arm and I have already ascended to Tier 5, the middle-aged elven woman said after briefly scanning the island with her eyes. Then, she turned to Meteor and Star Snail and continued, "But you 2 have lucked out. Don't tease us, Big Sis Storm," the red-haired youth named Meteor tamely said. "Star Snail and I admire you and Big Brother Saint Arm a lot. You 2 are only half a step away from reaching the 5th floor standard, whereas Star Snail and I are still far from even reaching the pseudo-5th floor standard." When Trecht and the other paragons saw how the middle-aged elven woman treated Meteor and Star Snail like they were her juniors and how Meteor's and Star Snail's obedient responses, they couldn't help but gape in shock. Meteor and Star Snail were both ranked among the top 10 of the miniature ancient world's god list. They had also become internal paragons of the Paimon conglomerate at a young age. With their current achievements, it was only a matter of time before they became core members of the Paimon conglomerate. Because of their statuses, Meteor and Star Snail didn't even have to behave respectfully when dealing with the 4 beast warriors. Yet, in front of the elven woman and tanned man, they behaved no differently than obedient kittens. However, when Meteor and Star Snail saw the reactions of Trecht and the other paragons, they simply rolled their eyes in response. "Ignorant fools!" Meteor inwardly sneered as he looked at Trecht and the others. Whether it was the middle-aged elven woman or the middle-aged giant man, both were core paragons nurtured by the Paimon conglomerate. In terms of combat standards, both of them have already reached the pseudo-5th floor standard. Although they were met with failure when competing with the position of Paimon's 10 great paragons and forced to ascend to Tier 5, so long as they reached Tier 6, they would be instantly promoted to elders in the Paimon conglomerate. At that time, they would only be 1 rank beneath the 3 overlords in the conglomerate's chain of command, and their statuses would be vastly superior to existences like the 4 beast warriors. Meanwhile, when the middle-aged elven woman saw the 2 cloaked figures standing outside the distant town, she looked to Platinum Behemoth and asked, "Are those 2 Zero Wings members?" "Yes." Platinum Behemoth hurriedly nodded. Apart from their group, the only players that could possibly be on this floating island right now were Zero Wings members. After hearing Platinum Behemoth's answer, the elven woman promptly swung the staff she wielded. "Disappear, you nuisances. If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible." Chapter 3308, Chapter 382, Another Lunatic. Chapter 3308, Chapter 382, Another Lunatic. Chapter 382, Another Lunatic. 1,000 yards away outside the town on the floating island. When the middle-aged elven woman swung the staff she wielded, 3 magic arrays with a 500-yard radius instantly formed in the sky, every one of them being a magic array for a Tier 5 spell. Tier 5 spell, Forbidden Realm. Tier 5 spell, Life Bondage. Tier 5 spell, Thunder's Fury. All 3 of these spells were top tier among Tier 5 spells. A Tier 5 Grand Wizard at the 4th floor standard would be fortunate if they could silent cast one of them, while a titled expert could only barely silent cast 2 simultaneously. After all, the complexity of spells increased exponentially along with the increase of their tiers. Yet, the elven woman had easily silent cast 3 Tier 5 spells simultaneously. The level of control she just displayed was simply ungodly, and even the 4 beast warriors and paragons such as Trecht couldn't help but widen their eyes in shock. Is this the strength of a pseudo 5th floor expert? Meteor couldn't help but sigh ruefully as he watched the 3 Tier 5 spells taking shape. Although he was regarded as a titled expert, which essentially meant he had reached the peak of the 4th floor standard, it was evident that there was still a huge gap between him and someone who had already taken half a step into the 5th floor standard. When can I also reach this standard? Star Snail wondered enviously. It might seem like titled experts were only one step away from matching pseudo 5th floor experts, but there was an insurmountable gap between the two. After all, a titled expert was still only at the domain realm, whereas a pseudo 5th floor expert was already in the beyond domain realm. A pseudo 5th floor expert could maintain peak focus at all times. They could even grasp their 6th sense, becoming able to predict all of their opponent's movements ahead of time and move in response to those predictions. On top of that, they could instinctively exhibit the power of silver combat techniques with their every move. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that a pseudo 5th floor expert could beat titled experts to a point where the latter couldn't even resist. Meanwhile, when Saint Arm, the 6-meter-tall man, saw the magic arrays in the sky, he said in dissatisfaction, "Aren't you a little too quick to act, Storm? How am I supposed to get any action like this? First come, first served. It's your fault for being slow," the elven woman named Storm nonchalantly responded. While Storm was speaking, the 3 Tier 5 spells she cast also began their performance. However, just when everyone thought the 3 Tier 5 spells would devastate the land outside the town, one of the cloaked figures, a woman, targeted by Storm's spells, suddenly stood up from the ground and drew her sword. Then, following her actions was a bright flash. When the bright flash disappeared, all mana in the sky vanished along with it. As a result, the 3 Tier 5 spells crumbled apart, failing to activate properly. Naturally, none of the lands outside the town was subjected to any devastation. Void Annihilation, the 26th ranked absolute technique. Platinum Behemoth exclaimed when he saw the empty space in the sky distorting. If the average player in the Greater God's domain were to see someone distorting space in the void, they would most likely think nothing of it. However, for any expert yearning to learn the Greater God's domain's 99 absolute techniques, they would instantly recognize it as the product of Void Annihilation, the 26th ranked absolute technique. This was because a certain Tier 6 powerhouse had relied on this technique to secure the championship of the 7 Luminaries League's A-League. In terms of raw power, Void Annihilation was already comparable to gold combat techniques. The only reason it was evaluated as an advanced silver combat technique was due to a limitation that prevented users from using the combat technique consecutively. Otherwise, it'd be no different than gold combat techniques. Before everyone could get over their shock from seeing Void Annihilation, the cloaked woman drew her sword once more. Boom! A thunderous explosion immediately echoed across the floating island. Then, before anyone could process what just happened, the space next to Storm suddenly distorted, forming a distorted barrier of sorts. "This will be your only warning. Turn back now," Laura declared as she looked in Storm's direction. Then, she sheathed her long sword and sat back down under the shade of the tree next to her, closing her eyes to rest. Is she crazy? Meteor and the others couldn't help but look at Laura with stupefied looks on their faces. It should be known that even Dira had to curb his arrogance in front of White Owl's party. Yet, Laura had threatened White Owl's party. What are these people from Zero Wing made of? Trecht was at a loss for words when he saw Laura threatening White Owl's party. Previously, he thought he had already seen the limits of insanity when he saw Black Flame killing Dira. He never thought he would see the day when someone would threaten a party of core paragons from the Paimon conglomerate to withdraw. For a moment, Trecht even had the urge to ask what Zero Wings members actually thought of the Paimon conglomerate. Do you think you're invincible just because you've grasped Void Annihilation? Storm was incensed by Laura's threat. Immediately, Storm executed Elven Heart, a god-ranked mana technique that elevated her concentration and mana standards. Then, 2 Tier 5 curses could be seen forming above and under Laura, both curses capable of exhibiting power comparable to Laura's Void Annihilation. Sensing the change in mana flow around her, Laura leisurely stood up and placed her hand around the hilt of her sword. Second form, Soul Break. There was no bright flash this time. Apart from seeing Laura mutter a few words, Meteor and the others saw nothing else happening. Instead, only silence followed after Laura stopped speaking. Then, before anyone realized it, Storm's HP fell to 0. If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. Chapter 3309, Chapter 383 Apex Clash. Chapter 3309, Chapter 383 Apex Clash. Chapter 383, Apex Clash. She died? Storm got killed in one hit. Meteor and the other Tier 4 experts present were at a loss for words when they saw Storm's HP suddenly falling to 0, none of them knowing what had just happened. Since when did Void Annihilation have a second form? What a quick strike! Platinum Behemoth broke out in cold sweat as he looked at Laura's distant figure. Platinum Behemoth was currently a Tier 5 player, so unlike Meteor and the other Tier 4 experts, he had caught a glimpse of Laura's attack just now. Or, more specifically, only those with Tier 5 physiques and reaction speeds could possibly hope to perceive Laura's attack. Meanwhile, from what Platinum Behemoth managed to see, Laura had executed 5 slashes after she finished speaking, each one faster than the last. By the 5th slash, he couldn't even see her attack. At the same time, Platinum Behemoth also saw Storm reacting to Laura's attacks, the elven woman instinctively creating a magic barrier and raising her staff to defend herself. However, Storm only managed to defend against the first 3 strikes, whereas the 4th and 5th slashes struck her squarely on the body. With the cloth armor Storm wore, there was no way she could survive 2 full Tier 6 attacks. Different from the 4 Beast Warriors and the various Tier 4 experts, White Owl, Saint Arm, and Dira reacted calmly to Storm's death. Before Meteor and the others could make sense of the 3's reactions, they suddenly saw Storm's body vanishing in the blink of an eye and reappearing at a location roughly 20 yards away. The elven woman was also alive and healthy at this time. You've even used Illusory World. Did you need to get so serious, Storm? Saint Arm jokingly said as he watched Storm flying back. When it came to pseudo-5th floor experts like them, it was incredibly difficult for opponents of the same tier to kill them. After all, by relying on the 6th sense they grasped after reaching the Beyond Domain realm, they could predict most, if not all, dangers and take appropriate countermeasures. Of course, it'd be a different story if the opponent had strength so overwhelming that it could render all of their countermeasures useless. However, it should be known that Storm possessed many life-saving capabilities. Not only did she possess numerous Tier 4 and Tier 5 life-saving spells, but she also had the True Amulet, a legendary equipment that could let her avoid death once a day. Unless the opponent was someone on the level of White Owl, it would take a significant amount of time to kill Storm. Moreover, that was under the precondition that Storm did not try to run away. If Storm focused on escaping, even White Owl could not kill her. Why don't you try fighting her, then? Storm said as she rolled her eyes at Saint Arm. Illusory World was a life-saving spell she learned after getting promoted to Tier 5. The spell allowed her to enter an illusory space while leaving behind a phantom of herself in the real world. The phantom possessed all of her abilities, and it could attack her opponents while she waited for an opportunity to launch an ambush from the illusory space. Originally, Storm had planned to launch a 2-pronged attack with her phantom. However, the instant she harbored thoughts of attacking Laura, her 6th sense warned her of great danger, so she promptly dismissed her plan of attacking Laura with her main body as well. Instead, she decided to let her phantom do all the fighting while she stood by and observed what kind of cards Laura had up her sleeves. Only, Storm didn't think her phantom would get killed after only one exchange. Me? Saint Arm shook his head. I'm no fool. She has a legendary weapon. I'm no match for her in a one-on-one. You. Storm grew even more incensed upon hearing Saint Arm's reply. She didn't think Saint Arm would be such a coward, admitting defeat without even trying to fight Laura. "Neither of you needs to take her on. Leave her to me," White Owl, the short-haired woman, suddenly said before leaping into the air. Then, while making her way to Laura, she added, "You two take care of the kid over there." "Understood." Storm and Saint Arm responded respectfully, neither of them questioning White Owl's decision as they were fully confident in their commander's capabilities. In addition to being one of the Paimon conglomerate's 10 great paragons, White Owl had also created an epic mana body for her Tier 5 promotion. In her current state, she could even hold her ground against actual Tier 6 players. Not to mention, Laura was only a Tier 5 Sword Saint. As a Tier 5 Divine Rune Warrior, White Owl could easily overpower Laura in terms of strength. As soon as Storm and Saint Arm voiced their responses, a great sword wrapped in starlight appeared in White Owl's right hand. Immediately afterward, White Owl swung the dazzling weapon with both hands, sending a blade of light flying in Laura's direction. At the same time, the mana around White Owl transformed into a miniature star that covered a 300-yard radius and disintegrated everything caught within its range. Starfall, the 49th ranked absolute technique. Is this the strength of one of Paimon's 10 great paragons? Trekt couldn't help but gasp when he saw the miniature star that had formed before him. Devastation. True devastation. Sensing the power contained within this miniature star, Trekt had no doubt that it could destroy an entire island in the miniature ancient world. Meanwhile, Laura finally got serious when going up against this devastating attack, choosing to unsheath the longsword by her waist as she got ready to welcome White Owl's attack. "What an amazing sword!" Shifeng mentally exclaimed as he looked at the dark long sword in Laura's hand. The entire weapon was pitch black like the night sky, and the blade was as thin as a cicada's wing. Yet, despite its dark appearance, the weapon radiated a faint silver glow. In the past, Laura would sheath her long sword as soon as she was done executing her attacks. So, this was the first time Shifeng could inspect it in detail. When it came to knowledge about one-handed swords, Shifeng wouldn't say that he was the most knowledgeable in the greater god's domain, but he dared to say that he ranked among the top 3. Yet, the long sword Laura wielded did not match the appearance of any legendary sword in his knowledge. In fact, it didn't even have the basic mana-gathering properties of a legendary weapon. However, there was no way Laura's longsword was beneath the legendary rank. Not on his life would Shifeng believe the weapon was inferior to legendary weapons. In that case, Shifeng could only think of one possibility to explain why he had no knowledge of Laura's weapon and why the longsword could exhibit the power of legendary weapons without having the basic properties of a legendary weapon. A fragmented divine artifact. What Laura wielded in her hand was a weapon Shifeng had constantly dreamed of obtaining during his previous life. For the sake of obtaining a fragmented divine weapon, he had even paid numerous powers exorbitant prices to help him in searching for clues. At this moment, Shifeng finally understood why Laura was confident she could break through the Paimon conglomerate's blockade once she got promoted to Tier 5. After all, a fragmented divine weapon could instantly elevate the average 4th floor expert to the apex of the greater god's domain once this expert reached Tier 6. If such a weapon was put into the hands of Laura's caliber, anything could become possible. Subsequently, Laura could be seen charging forward and stabbing her long sword into the miniature star that White Owl had transformed into. When both sides made contact, dazzling lights emerged from the point of contact. Then, the miniature star could be seen rapidly dimming before eventually bursting apart and revealing White Owl using both hands to swing her starlight greatsword into Laura's dark longsword. Boom! A powerful explosion resulted from the collision of weapons. However, it wasn't the last explosion, but rather the first of many as White Owl began brandishing her starlight greatsword and sending a barrage of attacks at Laura as if she were firing a machine gun. Tier 5 Taboo Skill, Self-Acceleration, Heaven's Collapse, the 30th Absolute Technique. The Taboo Skill and Absolute Technique combined allowed White Owl to become a machine of mass destruction. She executed over 100 attacks in the blink of an eye, and not even Tier 5 players like the 4 Beast Warriors could keep up with the attacks. However, Laura was not at all inferior to White Owl. With a simple thrust of her long sword, over 100 streamers formed before her, each streamer carrying power at the Tier 6 standard. Boom! 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 After hundreds of exchanges between Laura and White Owl, the sky above the floating island began to distort, and even the legendary monsters on the island started to distance themselves from the town. However, as the number of exchanges increased, those spectating the fight quickly noticed a problem: White Owl's HP was decreasing bit by bit. Although White Owl would only lose small amounts of HP in every exchange, her HP had already fallen to 70% after several hundred exchanges. At this rate, it was clear that it was only a matter of time before White Owl got killed. Partway through the fight, White Owl suddenly distanced herself from Laura. Then, she glared at Storm and Saint Arm, shouting, "Why aren't you two getting rid of that kid yet?" Storm and Saint Arm instantly snapped out of their dazes when they heard White Owl's words. Their commander's intentions were clear: they were to work with her to deal with Laura after taking care of Black Flame. Understanding this, Storm and Saint Arm promptly charged at Chiffon, who had similarly been watching the show this entire time. "Don't blame Big Sister for this, kid. It'll only hurt for a moment," Storm said, licking her lips as she looked at Chiffon. Then, she transformed her staff into a large thunderbolt and threw it at Chiffon. The move Storm just used was Thunder God's Spear, an additional active profound inheritance that came with her staff. Meanwhile, the speed and power of this move were not at all inferior to Laura's Void Annihilation. If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. Chapter 3310, Chapter 384, 1 vs 2. Chapter 3310, Chapter 384, 1 vs 2. Chapter 384, 1 vs 2. Accompanied by thunder, the Thunder God's Spear in Storm's hand instantly flew through the sky and reached Chiffon, its speed so fast that even Meteor and the other spectating Tier 4 experts had failed to catch it. However, at the same time as the Thunder God's Spear arrived before Chiffon, the flow of time seemingly slowed down. Moreover, this phenomenon wasn't limited to just Chiffon's vicinity. Everything within a 500-yard radius had seemingly entered a state of stagnation. The descent of the falling leaves had slowed to a halt, and the dirt raised from the ground stayed suspended in the air. At this moment, Chiffon, the epicenter of this strange phenomenon, appeared to be the only existence unaffected. Subsequently, Chiffon could be seen unsheathing the Winter of Eternal Night and executing a simple strike against the Thunder God's Spear, forcibly altering its trajectory. Ultimately, the Thunder God's Spear failed to hit Chiffon, only brushing past Chiffon's shoulder and flattening a distant mountain. How can a Tier 4 player possibly deflect that kind of attack? Meteor was greatly shocked as he looked at the flattened mountain. After all, going by the destruction caused, Storm's Thunder God's Spear was already close to rivaling a Tier 6 player's attack. What did he do? Saint Arm was similarly surprised by this turn of events. He knew very clearly how powerful the attack was. Now that Storm had reached Tier 5 already, few existences below Tier 6 should be able to stop her Thunder God's Spear. Even if pseudo-fifth floor experts could predict the attack's trajectory, they wouldn't be able to evade it, let alone deflect it. Yet, Chiffon had accomplished this feat through some unknown means. Chiffon drastically slowed down the flow of time around him, causing the Thunder God's Spear to lose much of its speed, which, in turn, allowed him to deflect the attack. This was the first time Saint Arm had seen such a phenomenon, and he couldn't help but find it unbelievable. As expected of Thunderstorm. I might have gotten killed if I hadn't promptly upgraded the Winter of Eternal Night to the legendary rank, Chiffon thought, feeling a little surprised as he looked at the vibrating Winter of Eternal Night. It might seem like he had deflected the Thunder God's Spear with little effort to everyone, but Chiffon knew just how close to death he was just now. The elven woman named Thunderstorm was one of the Paimon conglomerate's iconic figures. She might not be on the level of the three overlords, but she was still a top-tier presence in the Seven Luminaries A-League. Thunderstorm was especially known for her mastery over the lightning element. Rather than an elementalist, it'd be more appropriate to describe her as a war goddess of thunder. Her attacks were often so fast that her opponents would get killed before they could even react. Although Thunderstorm had yet to reach Tier 6, her current strength was already plenty terrifying. If not for the Winter of Eternal Night having the hidden ability to freeze all things, Chiffon would have definitely failed to react to Thunderstorm's attack just now. After all, Chiffon was still only a Tier 4 player, while his opponent was a Tier 5 player equipped with a 6-piece fragmented legendary equipment set and 1 piece of legendary equipment. Even if he had a legendary weapon and Tier 5 physique, winning against an expert like Thunderstorm would still be impossible. Die. Not giving Shifeng any time to rest, Saint Arms suddenly appeared in front of Shifeng, wielding 2 massive shields. Then, he smashed both shields down at Shifeng, his hulking frame making it look like a house was crashing down on Shifeng. However, Saint Arm wasn't just attacking Shifeng with a straightforward shield bash. During his attack, Saint Arm also executed a rapid footwork, instantly creating over 20 realistic afterimages around Shifeng, his speed so fast he could put Tier 5 assassins to shame. Earthen Dance. Shifeng remained unfazed when he saw Saint Arm's realistic afterimages. Instead, he calmly activated World of Frost, causing the flow of time around him to stagnate even more and creating 9 frost swords around him. Ninefold Swords Orbit. Immediately, Shifeng brandished the 9 frost swords, creating a field of stars that rapidly orbited him in a 50-yard radius. He did not dare to underestimate Saint Arm in the slightest. Saint Arm was of the giant race, one of the few races with the Titan bloodline. At the same time, he also had the Time Guardian class, which was considered a lost class in God's domain. Unlike the Winter of Eternal Night, which manipulated time by freezing it, Saint Arm could manipulate time itself. Using this ability, he could accelerate his movements to a significant degree and maintain that accelerated speed throughout entire fights. Meanwhile, as a Tier 5 Time Guardian, Saint Arm could increase his speed by a maximum of 300%. 100% plus 300%. Of course, this powerful ability wasn't without its flaws. Although Time Guardians could increase their movement speed and attack speed to extraordinary extents, their reaction speeds would remain unchanged. So, if a Time Guardian's neural reactions couldn't keep up with their movements, they would only worsen their combat performance if they accelerated themselves too much. In Saint Arm's case, he could only afford to increase his speed by 200%. Subsequently, the countless stars formed around Shifeng started striking Saint Arm's twin shields one after another, each collision pushing Saint Arm back a little. In no time at all, Saint Arm was pushed out of the field of stars, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't get within 50 yards of Shifeng. Damn it! Is he really just a Tier 4 Sword Emperor? Saint Arm gnashed his teeth as he looked at the countless stars that orbited Shifeng. Normally, swordsmen and assassins were Saint Arm's favorite classes to go against. This was because both of these classes relied on speed to achieve combat superiority. However, ever since Saint Arm class changed from a shield warrior into a Time Guardian, he was able to overwhelm both classes in terms of speed, negating the advantage of both classes. On top of that, shield warriors were inherently superior to swordsmen and assassins in terms of strength. So, he had essentially become the perfect counter to swordsmen and assassins. But now, not only were Shifeng's frost swords overpowering him, but they were also overwhelming his reaction speed. So long as he got within 50 yards of Shifeng, he would have to face the attacks of at least 5 frost swords simultaneously. In such a situation, he didn't have any room for evasive maneuvers and could only receive the attacks with his shield. Keep him pinned for me, Saint Arm, Storm suddenly said to Saint Arm through the team chat. I refuse to believe he can withstand Thunder Realm's avatar. Thunder Realm's descent. You got it. Saint Arm promptly nodded when he heard Storm's words. Thunder Realm's descent was a combination attack Storm had developed, and it was her ultimate trump card. The attack combined Thunder Realm with a magic barrier that enhanced the curse's power. In the case of Thunder Realm, it was a powerful curse that launched many thunderbolts. Now that Storm was at Tier 5, the curse could easily overwhelm even the reaction speeds of Tier 5 players. As for the magic barrier, it functioned to enhance the power of the individual thunderbolts launched. Subsequently, Saint Arm began attacking Shifeng in a frenzied manner, forcing Shifeng to defend himself with all of his strength to prevent the Time Guardian from getting close to him. In the meantime, Storm began chanting a series of incantations and drawing magic arrays with her staff. From time to time, she would also throw a bunch of mana stones at certain locations. In less than 10 seconds, over 30 Grandmaster magic arrays had appeared in Shifeng's vicinity, these magic arrays linking together to form one big magic array that covered a 1,000-yard radius. Amazing. She used less than 10 seconds to create a Grandmaster barrier, Trekt exclaimed as he looked at the barrier before him. The construction of magic barriers was complicated and time-consuming. Normally, magicians would prepare magic barriers in advance using magic scrolls. That way, they simply needed to use the scrolls whenever they needed to use a magic barrier. Of course, there was also a problem in doing so. Barriers formed using magic scrolls would have weaker than average power. This was because mana needed to be supplied to the magic scrolls beforehand, and this stored mana would wear away with time. Moreover, due to the limitations of the materials used to create magic scrolls, only a limited amount of mana could be stored in them. Normally, a magic barrier constructed using magic scrolls would be fortunate to exhibit half of the power of the real deal. But because it didn't take much time to construct a magic barrier using magic scrolls, such barriers were much more practical in actual battles. Hence, hardly anyone in the greater god's domain would attempt to construct a magic barrier from scratch in the middle of a battle. Yet, Storm had used less than 10 seconds to construct a Grandmaster barrier. The level of skill she possessed was simply astounding. When Storm saw that her magic barrier was active, she promptly waved her staff and shouted, "Thunder Realm. If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible." Chapter 3311, Chapter 385, Magic Suppression. Chapter 3311, Chapter 385, Magic Suppression. Chapter 385, Magic Suppression. TL Notes, fixed an error in Chapter 384. When Storm saw that her magic barrier was active, she promptly waved her staff and shouted, "Thunder Realm." Fix 2. When Storm saw that her magic barrier was active, she promptly waved her staff and shouted, "Thunder Realm's Descent." On the floating island. As soon as Storm finished speaking, a magic barrier that covered a 1,000-yard radius appeared around Shafong, thunderbolts constantly striking the inside of the barrier. Every thunderbolt carried as much power as the Thunder God's spear previously used by Storm, and these thunderbolts easily numbered more than 300. Upon sensing the devastating power the thunderbolts carried, even the 4 beast warriors spectating from a distance couldn't help but shudder. Although the 4 of them had already become Tier 5 players, they knew they couldn't survive this move, even if all 4 of them worked together. Tier 5 players might have a much stronger physique than Tier 4 players, but even a Tier 5 player would be fortunate if they could defend against 100 of these thunderbolts simultaneously. The fact that Thunder Realm could let its user launch over 300 attacks simultaneously was also why, despite having weaker than average raw power compared to other Tier 5 curses, it was still labeled as a curse. However, thanks to the Grandmaster barrier created by Storm, every one of her Thunder Realm's 300+ lightning bolts now carried power at the Tier 6 standard. Even Tier 6 experts would feel their scalps going numb when going up against such an attack, let alone Tier 5 players. Is this the strength of the conglomerate's core paragons? Meteor was in awe as he watched Storm controlling over 300 lightning arcs. Until this point, Meteor had always been confident he could enter the ranks of the Paimon conglomerate's core paragons in the future. After all, he was currently already considered a paragon among the conglomerate's internal members. However, after seeing Storm's performance, his confidence started to waver because he realized that the gap between him and an actual core paragon was unbelievably huge. At this time, Meteor even had a feeling that Storm could already go up against the Tier 6 experts of corporations in her current state. With her ability to manipulate over 300 lightning bolts carrying power at the Tier 6 standard, it wouldn't even be an exaggeration to say that Storm was a goddess of thunder. Meanwhile, after seeing the barrier taking shape, Saint Arm promptly fled out of it, not daring to stay within it for even a moment longer. Although Storm could manipulate the thunderbolts in the magic barrier, she had to manage over 300 thunderbolts at all times. If she mismanaged them and he got hit by a few, he would still be vaporized, even if he was a shield warrior. When Storm saw that Saint Arm had exited the barrier, she looked at Shafong and smiled, saying, "You can take pride in the fact that you got me to use Thunder Realm's Descent." After saying so, Storm pointed at Shafong, and all 300+ lightning bolts in the barrier transformed into agile serpents that attacked Shifeng from all directions. At this time, even White Owl and Laura, who were fighting in the distant sky, couldn't help but glance at Storm's Thunder Realm's descent. "If you're thinking of saving him, you best go now before it's too late," White Owl said, grinning as she looked at Laura. "Otherwise, he might very well suffer soul annihilation at Storm's hands." Tier 6 attacks already had the power to heavily damage Tier 5 immortal souls. If Storm could land all 300+ of her thunderbolts, she could even annihilate a Tier 5 immortal soul, let alone a Tier 4 immortal soul. This was also why White Owl had chosen to bring Storm into the miniature ancient world with her. "Do I help him?" Laura couldn't help but grow a little worried when she saw Storm's attacks. Honestly, even she would have difficulty dodging all 300+ thunderbolt attacks, let alone Shifeng, who wasn't even a Tier 5 player. Yet, if she tried to save Shifeng, White Owl definitely wouldn't let such a good opportunity slip. Currently, although Laura could suppress White Owl, that was because of her slight advantage in strength. When it came to movement speed, attack speed, and reaction speed, they were about evenly matched. So, if she let herself get distracted by Storm's thunderbolts, White Owl would have a great chance of killing her. Yet, if Laura didn't save Shifeng, Storm's attack might really extinguish Shifeng's soul. While Laura was hesitating about what to do, Shifeng, who was inside the magic barrier, suddenly smiled. "You call this Thunder Realm's descent? I'll show you what a true Thunder Realm's descent looks like." After saying so, Shifeng had the 9 frost swords insert themselves into the ground and form a magic barrier around him. Meanwhile, he drew a series of divine runes with his left hand and had these runes merge themselves with the space around him. Once the divine runes merged with the surrounding space, the 300+ lightning serpents started to actively avoid Shifeng as if afraid of him. Although the lightning serpents continued to linger around Shifeng, none dared to touch him. Impossible. Storm was dumbfounded when she saw her attacks failing to harm Shifeng in the slightest. She had launched over 300 attacks at the Tier 6 standard, but none managed to damage Shifeng. Moreover, it looked like Shifeng had used less effort to neutralize these attacks than when he neutralized her Thunder God's spear. Is he really just a Tier 4 Sword Emperor? Trekt's mouth turned into a big O shape as he looked at Shifeng. Although Shifeng was currently wearing a black cloak to hide his personal information, the life aura he exuded clearly indicated that he was only a Tier 4 player. But could a Tier 4 Sword Emperor really resist 300+ Tier 6 attacks? Was he hiding his strength the last time we fought? Platinum Behemoth, who had previously fought Shifeng in the Thunder Restaurant, also gaped in shock at this sight. While everyone outside the magic barrier was looking at Shifeng in shock, Shifeng raised his hand and created one magic array after another before him. With each magic array Shifeng created, the mana in the magic barrier also grew denser. "I've seen your moves already, so it's your turn to see mine now." Suddenly, everyone outside the barrier felt a change in Storm's magic barrier. Before anyone could determine what had happened, the lightning serpents lingering around Shifeng suddenly merged into one big ball. Had Storm and Saint Arm opted to attack him together without using any fancy moves, Shifeng would have indeed had difficulty tackling them. He might not even last long against them. After all, the Winter of Eternal Night could only remain at the legendary rank for a limited time. However, it was a different story now that Storm had set up a magic barrier. In the entire Greater God's domain, no expert would dare to use magic barriers against a great Grandmaster magician. This was because doing so was akin to suicide. Subsequently, once the numerous lightning serpents finished merging into one big ball of lightning, the lightning sphere gradually transformed into a lightning dragon that measured several hundred meters in length. The lightning dragon was also vastly stronger than the lightning serpents from before. "Go," Shifeng said as he pointed at the elven woman standing over 1,000 yards away. As if understanding Shifeng's words, the lightning dragon bellowed at Storm and flapped its wings. Despite being Thunder Realm's caster, Storm could not exert any control over the lightning dragon created from her Thunder Realm. Before anyone could react, the massive lightning dragon shot through the magic barrier and devoured Storm in the blink of an eye. Then, the lightning dragon disappeared along with its creator, leaving behind only a piece of equipment. "If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. Chapter 33:12. Chapter 33:12. Chapter 386, Shifeng's Secret Storm? Saint Arm fell into a daze when he saw Storm getting vaporized. In terms of combat standards, Storm was not at all inferior to him. When it came to life-saving measures, Storm even had the upper hand. After all, as an elementalist, it would be fatal for her if her opponents managed to get within melee range, so it was only natural she placed more focus on gathering life-saving measures. Meanwhile, combined with her sixth sense, so long as Storm focused on fleeing, not even White Owl could kill her. Yet, now, Storm had died. Moreover, she had died at the hands of her own Thunder Realm's descent. What did he do? Meteor and the other Tier 4 spectators were confused and horrified as they looked at Shifeng's figure inside the barrier, none of them able to understand what had just happened. The Tier 5 curse clearly originated from Storm. Yet, the curse not only refused to obey Storm, but it even turned around to kill Storm. This situation completely exceeded their understanding of God's domain. Everyone, retreat. While everyone was in a panic, White Owl suddenly issued a retreat order through the team chat. Commander Owl, this is the Void Saint legacy we are talking about, Dira hurriedly said when he heard White Owl's call for retreat. We might never come across another opportunity like this if we miss it. The Void Saint class was a stepping stone into the Seven Luminaries Alliance's Senate. Not even Apex powers would be willing to abandon such an opportunity, let alone the Paimon conglomerate. If you wish to suffer soul annihilation, be my guest, White Owl curtly said before taking out a group teleportation crystal and enveloping everyone on her team in a teleportation array. At the same time, everyone in the teleportation array received a prompt asking them whether they agreed to get teleported. Damn it. Dira reluctantly looked at the nearby town before gnashing his teeth and agreeing to the teleportation. Immediately, White Owl and the others vanished into thin air, leaving only Shifeng and Laura on the floating island. They sure didn't take their time leaving, Laura remarked as she watched White Owl's team teleporting away. However, she did not bother chasing after them, opting to sheath her sword instead. A group teleportation crystal could teleport everyone on the same team together. It was a rare and precious tool that was valued at 5,000 units of Seven Luminaries crystal in the Greater God's domain, and they were usually treated as strategic items by the various powers. Although the floating island's barrier prevented players from directly teleporting out of the island, it was still possible to teleport to the barrier's edge. There was quite some distance between her current location and the barrier's edge, so unless she employed the help of teleportation magic as well, there was no way she could catch up to them. It's a good thing that they've left, Shifeng said, wryly smiling when he saw that Laura still wanted to fight. I can only fight them for a short time. Had the battle dragged on for a little longer, I would have most likely had to flee. Shifeng could only make use of Thunder Realm's descent once. After all, he had already eliminated Storm, the source of the combination attack. Meanwhile, without Thunder Realm's descent or an attack of a similar caliber, there was no way Shifeng could kill Saint Arm. At best, he could hold his ground against the Time Guardian. After all, a legendary weapon might grant its wielder the strength to transcend tiers, but the precondition was that the opponent wasn't equipped with a legendary weapon or equipment. Meanwhile, Saint Arm obviously wasn't part of this category of opponents. Moreover, apart from the legendary rank Winter of Eternal Night, another reason Shifeng could match Saint Arm was because of his level of 155. That put him 15 levels above Saint Arm. If Shifeng was only at level 140, he would have definitely been put at a disadvantage against Saint Arm. Hence, had the battle dragged on until Ancient Dragon's power's duration ran out, Shifeng would have to either flee or get killed by Saint Arm. But I have to say, what you did just now was truly incredible. Could you perhaps be that Yi Feng who recently became a great Grandmaster Magician? Laura asked as she looked at Shifeng suspiciously. It is almost impossible to take over someone else's magic in God's domain. Unless, of course, you managed to grasp all of the magic arrays in that woman's mana body. But that evidently isn't feasible. Besides that, the only other method I can think of is if you manipulated that woman's mana through her magic barrier. Previously, Storm had cast her curse via her magic barrier so as to strengthen its output. Hence, so long as Shifeng could take control of Storm's magic barrier, he would gain control over her curse. However, that was easier said than done. Taking over another person's magic barrier was an incredibly challenging and time-consuming feat, as one would have to discern the mana nodes in the other person's magic barrier. On top of that, one would need to have control over mana that was superior to the barrier's creator so that one could win control over these mana nodes. It should be known that Storm was a Grandmaster magician. So, the fact that Shifeng had not only managed to take control of Storm's magic barrier but also accomplished it in such a short time was simply unbelievable. Apart from Shifeng being a great Grandmaster magician, Laura truly couldn't think of any other explanations for this situation. Meanwhile, although great Grandmaster magicians were exceedingly rare in the Greater God's domain, it just so happened that a new one had appeared not long ago. Linking these two events together, Laura couldn't help but overthink matters. "You've guessed correctly, Commander Laura," Shifeng said, openly admitting to Laura's suspicion. Then, he chuckled and added, "But please keep this a secret. Others might not be able to link him with Yifeng, but it wasn't a difficult thing for Laura to guess the connection. After all, Laura was aware of his ability to freely travel between worlds. Moreover, the timing of his recent trip to the Greater God's domain coincided with his becoming a great Grandmaster magician. "Don't worry. I won't tell anyone about it," Laura said. Then, she grinned and continued, "But if the Divine Seal Saint were to find out that you're that Yifeng, he'll probably lose his mind." The ultimate goal of the Greater God's domain's various powers was to explore the void zones situated in the gaps between realms. Meanwhile, exploring these void zones necessitated the construction of bases. However, unless a stronghold was protected by a great Grandmaster defensive magic array, it would need a large amount of manpower to keep it standing in the void zone. This led to a situation where great Grandmaster defensive magic arrays were in high demand. However, there were far too few great Grandmaster magicians in existence. In the current era, there didn't even exist 100 great Grandmaster magicians across the entire Greater God's domain. In other words, there were more realms than there were great Grandmaster magicians. Moreover, most of these great Grandmaster magicians were gathered in the 12 sanctuaries, leaving even fewer greater Grandmaster magicians for the other realms. To make matters worse, these great Grandmaster magicians needed a lot of time to produce even one great Grandmaster defensive magic array. Because of this, even if a power was willing to pay an exorbitant price to hire the services of a great Grandmaster magician, it would need to make a reservation for several decades later. Anyway, we can't defend this place for much longer. The forces the Divine Seal Saint dispatched shouldn't be limited to just White Owl's group of 3. Those 3 must have used some special means to reach this place ahead of the main army. Once the Divine Seal Saint's army of experts arrives, even escaping will be a challenging task for us, Laura said, feeling a little worried. The strength of the experts the Divine Seal Saint dispatched had exceeded Laura's expectations. If she had to fight against White Owl, she could only afford to take on a few more Tier 5 experts. However, the Divine Seal Saint had dispatched thousands of Tier 4 experts, and many among them would complete their Tier 5 promotion as soon as they entered the World Passage. If this army of Tier 5 experts arrived, she could, at best, flee with several people. It'd be impossible for her to escape with all of Zero Wing's members. "You don't have to worry about this, Commander Laura. So long as we can defend this place until the others return from their trials, I am confident in bringing everyone away safely," Shifeng confidently said. From what Shifeng learned during his previous life, the Void God settlements relied on divine seals created by ancient gods to imprison dangerous demigods. So long as he could release these imprisoned demigods and create some chaos, it should be easy for him and his team to escape the Divine Seal Saint's army. If Shifeng was still only a Grandmaster magician, he would have had a hard time undoing these divine seals. However, now that he had become a great Grandmaster magician, these divine seals were not a problem for him. It was only a question of whether he was willing to invest the time to undo these seals. Before Shifeng set off in search of the sealing grounds, he waved his hand at the item Storm dropped when she died, causing the item to fly into his hand. If this was an item dropped by any other player, Shifeng might not have been particularly interested in it. However, Storm was a core paragon of the Paimon conglomerate. Every item she carried with her would be incredibly valuable, so he naturally couldn't ignore it. Meanwhile, after taking a look at the light purple metal piece in his hand, Shifeng couldn't help but be rendered speechless. Is Paimon so rich that it can afford to give away even things like this? If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. Chapter 3313, Chapter 387, Fragmented Legendary Sacred Armor. Chapter 3313, Chapter 387, Fragmented Legendary Sacred Armor. Chapter 387, Fragmented Legendary Sacred Armor. Is Paimon crazy? It's letting a mere core paragon use a suit of fragmented legendary sacred armor? Apart from Shifeng, Laura similarly revealed a surprised look when she saw the light purple metal piece. Even Apex powers would only be willing to let core paragons with great contributions use their fragmented legendary sacred armor. Could Paimon be overflowing with sacred armor of this caliber? Sacred armor was different from the average equipment. They usually came in complete sets and did not have any attribute or tier requirements. Players could equip sacred armor so long as their control over mana was sufficiently high. Meanwhile, so long as players could don a suit of sacred armor, they would see a significant improvement in their control over mana. In the Greater Gods domain, a suit of epic-ranked sacred armor could sell for a whopping 100,000 units of 7 luminaries crystal, whereas a suit of fragmented legendary-ranked sacred armor couldn't even be found on the market. Fragmented legendary sacred armor was so rare and precious that players and powers who owned a suit wouldn't even be willing to trade it for several pieces of legendary equipment. After all, sacred armor were items passed down from the Greater Gods domain's ancient era, and there was no way to reproduce them in the modern era. Hence, every suit used was one less suit available in the Greater Gods domain. It was also highly unlikely a used suit of sacred armor would be handed over to another player, especially not a fragmented legendary sacred armor. This was because sacred armor could grow with their wearers. Apart from providing more basic attributes, a suit of sacred armor would also provide an increasingly greater improvement to mana control as their wearer leveled up. On top of that, not only would the suit of sacred armor eventually become fully compatible with its wearer, but it could also grow in rank. In the case of fragmented legendary sacred armor, it could ultimately grow into a legendary equipment set, which was why nobody would be willing to exchange a suit of fragmented legendary sacred armor for even several pieces of legendary equipment. However, before a suit of fragmented legendary sacred armor became a player's personalized equipment set, it would have an extremely high chance of dropping on death. Hence, any power that owned such sacred armor would be incredibly careful when handing them out to their paragons. After all, this was a potential legendary equipment set they were talking about. Not even Apex powers would dare to fool around with such a precious treasure. Yet, now, the Paimon conglomerate had given a suit of fragmented legendary sacred armor to Storm, someone who wasn't even among the conglomerate's 10 great paragons. If the Paimon conglomerate could afford to be so generous with its fragmented legendary sacred armor, it wouldn't even be an exaggeration to call it the Starlight Realm's #1 conglomerate. No, this thing looks like it's broken, Shifeng said, wryly smiling after he finished inspecting the worn-out divine runes engraved on the light purple metal piece. This thing might be a suit of fragmented legendary sacred armor, but with its runes damaged, not only will it have a significantly higher equipment requirement, but its strength will also only be slightly stronger than epic sacred armor when equipped. Moreover, it can't grow along with its wearer. At best, this thing is worth 60 to 70,000 units of 7 luminaries crystal. Fragmented legendary sacred armor might be priceless, but it was a different story for a damaged suit. In the case of a damaged suit, it wouldn't even be worth as much as epic sacred armor. After all, an intact suit of epic sacred armor could still grow into a fragmented legendary equipment set. At that time, it would be vastly stronger than a half-baked fragmented legendary sacred armor. What a pity, Laura said as she looked at the metal piece in Shifeng's hand. There are no known methods of repairing sacred armor in the current Greater Gods domain. Otherwise, even while damaged, this thing would be worth more than a 6-piece legendary equipment set. An intact suit of fragmented legendary sacred armor could ultimately transform into a 6-piece legendary equipment set that was perfectly compatible with its wearer. Unlike other 6-piece legendary equipment sets, it could let players unleash their potential to the greatest extent. Indeed, Shifeng nodded but chose not to say anything more. There might not be any known methods to repair sacred armor in the current Greater God's Domain, but Shifeng knew of a place that might have a way to do so: the Greater God's Domain's 3 great workshops. The 3 great workshops predated even the Greater God's Domain's recorded history. So, it wasn't out of the question for them to hold a means to repair sacred armor. After all, if these workshops could manufacture even epic combat puppets, it shouldn't be too difficult for them to repair sacred armor. Subsequently, Shifeng put away the damaged fragmented legendary sacred armor and began searching for the Void God's sealing grounds. After following the flow of mana in the floating island's magic barrier for half a day, Shifeng finally discovered a cave that was sealed by a separate magic barrier. Moreover, apart from the barrier, the cave was also guarded by several level 150, tier 5 legendary monsters. "Is it here?" Shifeng couldn't help but be flabbergasted when he looked at the 5 soul devourers resting in front of the cave entrance. Soul Devourer, ancient magic creature, legendary, level 150 HP 600 billion. Soul Devourers were incredibly troublesome monsters that could devour the immortal souls of players. If a tier 4 player had their souls devoured by a Soul Devourer, they could basically say goodbye to God's Domain forever. As for tier 5 players, if they got killed by a Soul Devourer, they'd have to be separated from God's Domain for at least 10 to 15 days. Hence, the existence of Soul Devourers was considered taboo in God's Domain. Meanwhile, if players wished to raid a tier 5 Soul Devourer, they would need a team of 100 tier 5 players of the same level at the very least. Moreover, that was if they were going up against only one tier 5 Soul Devourer. Currently, however, there were 5 tier 5 Soul Devourers resting outside the cave. Moreover, the magic barrier protecting the cave was bound to these 5 Soul Devourers. In other words, unless these 5 Soul Devourers were eliminated, the magic barrier would remain standing. Fortunately, the situation wasn't completely hopeless, not for Shifeng, at least. After analyzing the structure of the cave's magic barrier with his expertise as a great Grandmaster Magician, Shifeng easily snuck through the magic barrier without giving the 5 Soul Devourers any chance to attack him. Then, he quickly made his way into the cave. Once inside the cave, Shifeng found that the deeper he traveled into the cave, the denser the eternal energy around him became. After walking for some time, Shifeng eventually arrived at an altar the size of several football fields. Meanwhile, the eternal energy around this altar was as dense as the eternal energy found on the 100 Refinement Building's 2nd floor. Before Shifeng could get close to the altar, he was frozen in place by a divine might originating from the altar. More specifically, the divine might came from a carbonized black sword suspended above the altar. With great struggle, Shifeng raised his head to look at the carbonized sword suspended in the air. Then, when he got a clear look at the sword, goosebumps rose all over his body. Why is the shadow incinerator here? If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. Chapter 3314, Chapter 388, Strongest Demigod. Chapter 3314, Chapter 388, Strongest Demigod. Chapter 388, Strongest Demigod. Shadow Incinerator. This was a name known by all throughout the Greater God's Domain during Shifeng's previous life. Just hearing this name would give the various realms a huge headache. This was because the Shadow Incinerator had destroyed dozens of realms in the Greater God's Domain. Meanwhile, the demigod who wielded the Shadow Incinerator to commit these atrocities was even labeled as the strongest demigod in the Greater God's Domain. Shouldn't the Shadow Incinerator be in the hands of the Crimson Wing? Shifeng was greatly confused as he looked at the carbonized sword hovering above the altar. From what Shifeng could remember, the Shadow Incinerator's wielder, Crimson Wing Ife, was never imprisoned by the ancient gods. There was no way the ancient gods could have imprisoned her, either. One of the reasons Ife was labeled as the strongest demigod was because she had slain a total of 8 ancient gods with the help of the Shadow Incinerator. Out of these 8 ancient gods, She had even slain 2 simultaneously. Not to mention, in the current timeline, the ancient gods still did not have any reason to imprison If. At this point in time, If should be nothing more than a newly born demigod in the angel sanctuary. She should have yet to become one of the angel sanctuary's 12 wings, a position awarded to the 12 strongest demigods in the angel sanctuary. It would only be some time later before If would win the title of Crimson Wing and become one of the 12 wings. As for the Shadow Incinerator, If had always been its wielder as far as Chiffon could remember. The weapon had never existed anywhere else before. He had even watched battle videos of If wielding it when competing for a spot among the 12 wings. Could this be a fake? Chiffon carefully scrutinized the carbonized sword in the air. However, even after plenty of observation, he couldn't find any signs of the carbonized sword being a fake Shadow Incinerator. Whether it was the carbonized sword's appearance or terrifying divine might, both were similar to what he saw and experienced in If's battle video. In fact, the carbonized sword before him felt stronger than the one in the battle video. After If became the strongest demigod, the Shadow Incinerator instantly rose to 5th place in the 7 Luminaries Alliance's divine weapon list. As for the top 4 divine weapons, they were only recorded in the Greater Gods Domain's history and had never appeared in the modern era. Meanwhile, according to the 7 Luminaries Alliance's description of the Shadow Incinerator, If could limit the mobility of Tier 6 players simply by unsheathing the weapon and releasing its divine might. The Shadow Incinerator's divine might was so powerful that even ordinary Tier 6 gods would more or less be affected, and only existences at the caliber of ancient gods could ignore it. However, even though the Shadow Incinerator before him was without a wielder, the divine might it naturally radiated was enough to immobilize him, someone who possessed physique and basic attributes at the Tier 5 standard. It wouldn't be inaccurate to say that the carbonized sword hovering above the altar was stronger than the Shadow Incinerator described in records. While Chiffon was wondering how he could free himself from the effects of the Shadow Incinerator's divine might, the sound of several system notifications suddenly entered his ears. System, you have started the Greater Gods Domain's Mythic Main storyline quest Incinerator's Shadow. Quest content, undo the myriad ancient gods seal. Rewards unknown. Penalties unknown. System warning, the Shadow Incinerator has bound your immortal soul. You are required to undo the Shadow Incinerator's divine might seal within 24 hours. Otherwise, the Shadow Incinerator will devour your immortal soul, and you will never be able to log into God's domain again. A Mythic Main storyline quest. Divine might seal. What the heck is this? Chiffon felt as if an explosion had just gone off in his mind when he saw the system notifications. Main storyline quests in the Greater Gods Domain were extremely dangerous. Because of this, once a main storyline quest reached the legendary rank, the system would give players the option to accept or refuse it. Yet, he did not receive such an option for the Mythic Main storyline quest he triggered. He was forced to accept the quest, regardless of his will. To make matters worse, he had to complete the quest within 24 hours or face soul annihilation. Rather than a quest, it'd be more appropriate to consider this a trap set for players who had accidentally stumbled upon the Shadow Incinerator. Unfortunately, the system's timer did not stop counting down, irregardless of what Chiffon thought of the situation. I need to quickly remove the seal. After seeing the countdown timer, Chiffon no longer cared whether the Shadow Incinerator before him was real or fake. His number one priority was to undo the divine might seal on him. Different from undoing a magic barrier seal, the process of undoing a divine might seal did not involve the player's mastery over mana. It only involved the player's concentration, and it could be said to be the most troublesome type of seal in God's domain. Fortunately, I dabbled a little in divine might seals in the past. Otherwise, I'd need at least several months to break this seal. Chiffon could feel several searing chains in the depths of his mind, and just spreading his senses over them caused him to experience excruciating pain. Divine might seals were a kind of mental attack in God's domain. It was also a method of attack players would gain after reaching Tier 6. Only, compared to Tier 6 gods, the mental attacks of Tier 6 players were nothing but a joke. At best, it could be used as a deterrence against players of the same tiers. Hence, few players would bother researching mental attacks. In the case of Tier 6 NPCs and Tier 6 monsters, though, they could often be seen using mental attacks. Hence, to have an easier time dealing with certain Tier 6 NPCs, Shifeng went out of his way to research mental attack methods, and among the attack methods he researched were Divine Might Seals. The process of unraveling a Divine Might Seal was simple. All he needed to do was find the seal's mental nodes and transform his concentration into a weapon to attack these nodes. So long as he could destroy these nodes, the Divine Might Seal would be finished. After several hours passed, Shifeng finally finished inspecting the seal in the depths of his mind. Although the process was excruciatingly painful, it was a necessary step to unravel the seal. There are 8 mental nodes. That's more than I expected. When Shifeng saw that he only had 16 hours remaining, he couldn't help but grow a little anxious. I need to work faster. Normally, breaking a mental node required 2 or 3 hours of continuous effort. Now that he had 8 mental nodes to deal with and only had 16 hours remaining, he could only afford to spend, at most, 2 hours on each node. However, after Shifeng shaped his concentration into a blade and smashed it into one of the searing chains in his mind, he couldn't help but be dumbfounded by the results. No damage. If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. Chapter 3315, Chapter 389, Tier 6 Concentration. Chapter 3315, Chapter 389, Tier 6 Concentration. Chapter 389, Tier 6 Concentration. When Shifeng saw no damage done to the illusory chain, surprise and consternation filled him. In God's domain, items constructed by the mind would more or less wear each other out when struck together. After all, mental objects were merely bodies of energy, and collision between 2 mental objects would result in both sides expending parts of their energy to mitigate the impact. It was just that most players in God's domain did not know how to mold their concentration into weapons. Hence, most players were unable to do anything about Divine Might Seals. However, so long as players could mold their concentration into an object, it was only a matter of time before they could break a Divine Might Seal. They wouldn't even need to find the seal's mental nodes to break it. Of course, the process would naturally be faster if they could target the mental nodes. Hence, the current situation confounded Shifeng a little. A collision between mental objects would have definitely resulted in a loss of mental energy to a certain extent. Could these chains not be made up of mental energy? Shifeng wondered as he scrutinized the illusory metal spheres responsible for linking the illusory chains with one another. Currently, there were over 1,000 such metal spheres in his mental sea. Although all of these metal spheres looked to be mental nodes at first glance, only 8 of them were actually responsible for holding up the foundation of the Divine Might Seal. However, no matter how Shifeng looked at these 8 metal spheres, they were undoubtedly mental objects. In other words, so long as they were struck by a foreign mass of mental energy, they should lose some of their own mental energy. Yet, that did not seem to have happened. Is it because my concentration standard is lacking? Is that why these metal spheres can ignore my attack? This was the only explanation Shifeng could come up with after racking his mind. However, upon coming to this conclusion, he couldn't help but have a headache. Currently, there was no doubt that he had already pushed the boundaries of a Tier 4 player, his concentration reaching the Tier 5 peak standard. Moreover, he had only reached this standard after becoming a great Grandmaster Magician. Otherwise, he would only be at the Tier 5 advanced standard. It should be known that most Tier 5 players didn't even have Tier 5 advanced concentration. Instead, they would be stuck at the Tier 5 basic standard. This was because, unlike levels, players could not develop their concentration by simply killing monsters or completing quests. Normally, if players wished to improve their concentration standard, they would have to continuously sharpen their mental will and learn how to control it. Apart from that, players could also improve their concentration standard by raising their tiers. After players reached a higher tier and gained a stronger physique, the stronger physique would subtly influence the improvement of their concentration. For players who got promoted to Tier 5, their physique could help to develop their concentration until the Tier 5 basic standard. However, this method of raising one's tier to develop one's concentration could only be used up till Tier 5, which was why most Tier 5 players' concentration would only be at the Tier 5 basic standard. As for why this method couldn't be used up to Tier 6, it was because of the requirements to get promoted to Tier 6. In God's domain, players seeking to reach Tier 6 would face three major problems. The first and second problems were related to the divine body. Firstly, players needed to gather the 100,000 units of 7 luminaries crystal, 1, required to construct a divine body. Secondly, players needed to know how to construct a divine body. As for the third problem, it was the requirement of having Tier 6 concentration. If players couldn't raise their concentration standard to Tier 6, they would be incapable of getting promoted to Tier 6. This was why many Tier 5 experts would get stuck at the cusp of Tier 6. As for individuals like Shifeng, who possessed Tier 5 peak concentration as a Tier 4 player, they were exceedingly rare in God's domain. The only reason Shifeng could achieve such a standard was that he had already sharpened his mental will to its limits and could not only materialize it but also materialize it into a metal object. It was also because he had such control over his mental will that he could remain undeterred by Tier 6 divine might. Currently, though, if Shifeng wished to further develop his concentration and push it to the Tier 6 standard, he would need to receive a qualitative improvement to the essence of his life, which would, in turn, allow his mental energy to achieve a qualitative leap. Otherwise, there was no way he could push his concentration to the Tier 6 standard as a Tier 4 player. After all, reaching Tier 6 in concentration meant going beyond the realm of mortals and entering the rank of gods. If he had Tier 6 concentration, he could make mortals kneel with nothing but a thought, which was also the so-called divine might. Although Shifeng could upgrade the Winter of Eternal Night to the legendary rank to elevate his physique to the Tier 5 standard, that would not change his life rating. He would still be incapable of pushing his concentration to Tier 6. No, there is a way. Shifeng smiled as a sudden flash of inspiration hit him. Then, he took out the damaged sacred armor from his bag space. I didn't think that Thunderstorm would come to my aid one day. System, you are attempting to equip a suit of sacred armor. To wield its effects, you will need to fully grasp the sacred armor's foundational mana. Do you still wish to equip it? Equip it, Shifeng answered without hesitation. Although the current mana equipment set he used was excellent, it was still vastly inferior to a damaged suit of fragmented legendary sacred armor. Not to mention, the sacred armor possessed a hidden ability that his mana equipment set did not. There was a fundamental difference between mana equipment and sacred armor in God's domain. Mana equipment was made of magic arrays and magic patterns that drew on mana from the surrounding environment to enable players to exhibit strength far beyond what they possessed. On the other hand, sacred mana was the exact opposite. Sacred armor on its own was a mana source, and players could gain greater strength by manipulating this mana source. Simply put, sacred armor offered players access to a second mana source. So, the more skilled players were at manipulating mana, the more benefits they could get from a suit of sacred armor. Eventually, players could even evolve a suit of fragmented legendary sacred armor into a legendary equipment set that was fully compatible with them. However, apart from having the basic properties of a mana source, sacred armor also came with a hidden ability, the ability to substitute the mana body of its wearer. In short, sacred armor could be modified to become a new mana body for players. Only, nobody would do such a thing under normal circumstances. Firstly, it was unnecessary. If players wanted a strong mana body, they could create one when getting promoted to Tier 5. If they failed to create a mana body with satisfactory standards, there was always the option of starting a new account. After all, Saint Armor could only ever be a substitute. Unless players had no desire to ascend to Tier 6, they would still need to use their own Tier 5 mana body when constructing their divine body. Secondly, the process of using sacred armor as a replacement for one's primary mana source was completely different from manipulating sacred armor as a secondary mana source. This was because the mana source of sacred armor had different operating principles than the mana body of players. Trying to use sacred armor as a replacement for the mana body was akin to manipulating a puppet to manipulate another puppet. However, Shifeng did not need to concern himself with these problems. This was because he only aimed to have the sacred armor replace his mana body so that it could change his life rating. I must succeed. After taking a deep breath, Shifeng promptly started to merge the Tier 5 mana body he created in the 100 refinement building into the sacred armor. TL notes: 1. 100,000 units of 7 luminaries crystal. In the main story, an ordinary divine body only costs 50,000 units for each construction attempt, whereas a superior divine body costs 100,000 units for each attempt. However, I'm not sure if the author still remembers the ordinary version. If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. Chapter 3316, Chapter 390, Shadow Incinerator. Chapter 3316, Chapter 390, Shadow Incinerator. Chapter 390, Shadow Incinerator. So this is why nobody has managed to repair damaged sacred armor. This level of craftsmanship is far beyond modern players. When Shifeng saw the magic arrays and divine patterns engraved within the sacred armor, he had his knowledge of sacred armor renewed. Although he had known about the existence of sacred armor during his previous life, he had never used one. Firstly, epic sacred armor was of no use to him. Secondly, fragmented legendary sacred armor was incredibly rare, their rarity surpassed only by divine equipment. Even apex powers wouldn't have more than a few suits of fragmented legendary sacred armor in their possession, so non-apex powers would naturally have an even more difficult time getting their hands on a suit. Meanwhile, after getting a close look at the magic arrays in the sacred armor, he finally understood what made sacred armor amazing. There was a mana source hidden inside the sacred armor, and this mana source was incredibly volatile. The volatility of the mana was comparable to that of ancient gods. It definitely wasn't a mana source players could use under normal circumstances. However, the magic arrays and divine patterns in the sacred armor acted to restrain this mana source, effectively weakening it. Moreover, the sacred armor itself was akin to a player's body, and it allowed players to integrate their consciousness with it. Meanwhile, what players needed to do after donning a suit of sacred armor was to synchronize their mana with the sacred armor's mana. Then, they could manipulate the volatile mana source within the sacred armor using the sacred armor's mana. There were 3 layers of seals inside the sacred armor, and they functioned specifically to restrain the volatile mana source. The better players were at controlling the sacred armor's mana, the more seals they could lift, and the more volatile mana they could use. By the time players had fully acclimatized themselves with the volatile mana and could remove all 3 seals, they could wield mana much stronger than the average Tier 6 divine body could produce. One could say that the sacred mana was a legacy. It was a legacy that allowed players to wield mana rivaling that of ancient gods. Currently, the Saint armor in Shifeng's possession had its sealing magic arrays damaged, making it impossible to unravel them. Hence, it could not be upgraded into a legendary equipment set. While fixing these magic arrays would fix this problem, these magic arrays were so complex that not even a great Grandmaster magician could hope to repair them. A craftsman magician would be needed for this task, at the very least. A craftsman magician. Even looking back throughout the greater gods' domain's long history, very few craftsman magicians had ever existed. During his previous life, Shifeng had never even heard of a craftsman magician appearing in the modern era. He only knew that there were several great Grandmaster magicians who were close to reaching the craftsman rank. However, unless these people came across a heaven-defying opportunity, they would never be able to cross the final threshold in their lifetimes. Fortunately, Shifeng's goal wasn't to repair the damaged magic arrays. He only needed to construct new magic arrays on top of them. Subsequently, time passed by quickly, and 12 hours had gone by in the blink of an eye. After Shifeng constructed multiple great Grandmaster magic arrays inside the sacred armor gradually transformed into a new mana body for him. When Shifeng completed the final magic array, the divine patterns engraved on the sacred armor suddenly glowed. What an incredible mana source! Looking at the mana source inside the sacred armor, Shifeng saw it seemingly coming back to life as it began devouring all mana in its surroundings with the help of the great Grandmaster mana gathering array he had constructed. Subsequently, the mana inside the altar's cavern began gathering around Shifeng, causing the density of the mana around him to skyrocket. In only a moment, The mana around Shifeng had achieved a solid state. In addition, even the surrounding eternal energy had begun to flood the inside of the sacred armor before getting devoured by the mana source there. Meanwhile, as the mana source started to devour mana and eternal energy, Shifeng could also feel his concentration standard gradually increasing. Or, more specifically, he could feel his life rating increasing. In only a few minutes, an indescribable divine might began spreading from Shifeng's body. Immediately afterward, Shifeng regained the ability to move his body, albeit with difficulty. Great. It's a success. When Shifeng sensed his brimming mental energy and volatile mana, he couldn't help but be surprised. Is this the strength of a Tier 5 legendary mana body? Currently, the Tier 5 mana body he constructed using the sacred armor not only allowed his concentration to reach the Tier 6 basic standard, but it even generated mana much stronger than what the legendary-ranked Winter of Eternal Night possessed. At this time, Shifeng even suspected the Tier 4 skills and spells he used could already match the power of Tier 5 skills and spells used by Tier 5 players. However, Shifeng did not continue inspecting his new mana body. Instead, he promptly began forming mental blades to attack the illusory metal spheres in his mental sea. With the assistance of his Tier 6 concentration, Shifeng could not only form the mental blades a lot quicker, but the strength of these mental blades was also vastly superior to the ones he had previously created. In no time, 5 realistic blades flew at a metal sphere. Boom! 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 5 explosions rang out one after another. The 5 mental blades Shifeng formed instantly burst apart upon coming into contact with the metal sphere. However, they also left behind 5 deep grooves on the metal sphere. Were Tier 6 mental blades this powerful? Shifeng was a little stunned when he saw the damage he had caused to the metal sphere. While it was true anyone capable of creating mental objects could break the mental nodes of a divine might seal, the process was by no means a quick one. Normally, even with Tier 6 concentration, 5 attacks were nowhere near enough to cause significant damage to a mental node. It was why most Tier 6 experts would get headaches when dealing with divine might seals. However, Shifeng didn't dwell on the matter for long. He didn't have much time left to undo the divine might seal, so he promptly resumed attacking the metal sphere. 1 mental node. 2 mental nodes. 3 mental nodes. Contrary to Shifeng's initial expectations, he did not need 16 hours to destroy all 8 mental nodes. Only an hour after he had started his offensive, the 8th mental node shattered under the attacks of his mental blades. At the same time, the many illusory chains that covered his mental sea gradually faded out of existence. When Shifeng sighed in relief and opened his eyes, he promptly noticed a change in the shadow incinerator hovering above the altar. The chains that originally encircled the shadow incinerator had started to crumble. Immediately afterward, Shifeng could hear the sound of a beating heart. It sounded like something was coming back to life. Before Shifeng could figure out what was happening, the shadow incinerator suddenly appeared before him. At this time, the terrifying divine might it originally radiated was completely gone, and the weapon looked like it was waiting for Shifeng to wield it. System, you have passed the shadow incinerator's trial. Do you wish to become the shadow incinerator's wielder? System, you have 10 seconds to decide. System warning, the shadow incinerator was sealed by the myriad ancient gods. So long as you become its wielder, you will become the myriad ancient gods' enemy. Favorability of all ancient gods will be reduced to hostile. If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. Chapter 3317, Chapter 391, Great Sinner Black Flame. Chapter 3317, Chapter 391, Great Sinner Black Flame. Chapter 391, Great Sinner Black Flame. All ancient gods will become hostile to me. Shifeng gasped when he saw the system notification. Ancient gods were the pinnacle of power in the greater god's domain. They were also the current rulers of the greater god's domain's 12 sanctuaries. After reaching Tier 6, if players wished to develop themselves further, they were bound to have dealings with these ancient gods sooner or later. Normally, Tier 6 experts would have to go to great lengths just to gain a few favorability points from an ancient god. Yet, Wielding the Shadow Incinerator would instantly cause the ancient god's favorability of him to plummet to negative 3,000 points, which was also the requirement for the hostile status threshold. At this abysmal favorability, any ancient god he encountered would almost certainly attack him without question. In other words, wielding the Shadow Incinerator would mean severing his path as a Tier 6 player. Do I become its wielder? Shi Feng hesitated as he looked at the carbonized sword before him. Honestly, it no longer mattered whether the Shadow Incinerator before him was the real deal or an imitation. From the powerful divine might it previously radiated, there was no doubt it was a divine artifact-ranked weapon. There weren't many chances to obtain a divine weapon in the greater god's domain. If he missed this chance, he might never come across another for the rest of his life. Yet, becoming the Shadow Incinerator's wielder would also mean becoming enemies with the entire greater god's domain. Although the myriad ancient gods would almost never show themselves in the greater god's domain, players who have reached the apex of the greater god's domain would know that the myriad ancient gods had never disappeared. On the contrary, they were the de facto owners of many historical ruins and NPC forces. They even controlled the resources necessary for players to become 3-star mental strength grandmasters. Without the ancient gods' resources, the difficulty for players to become 3-star mental strength grandmasters in the real world would increase tenfold. System: you have 3 seconds left to decide. System: you have 2 seconds left to decide. System: you have 1 second left to decide. To hell with it. When the timer was about to reach 0, Shi Feng reached out and held onto the Shadow Incinerator's hilt. Despite having many dealings with the ancient gods during his previous life, he had still failed to get his hands on a divine weapon. All he got in return was a bunch of apex powers coming after his head. If he had a divine weapon in hand back then, those apex powers wouldn't have dared to hunt him so openly. Now that he had a chance to get his hands on a divine weapon, so what if he had to become enemies with the myriad ancient gods? It should be known that If, the Crimson Wing, had slain 8 ancient gods with the Shadow Incinerator. If not for If suddenly going missing, her name would have definitely been among the greater god's domain's 16 great Tier 6 NPCs. After Shi Feng became the Shadow Incinerator's wielder, the weapon's full attribute panel appeared before him. Shadow Incinerator, Dark Soul, One-Handed Sword, Sealed Godly Relic, Equipment Requirement. Soulbound Attack Power, 400% of Strength, Attack Speed, 2% of Strength and Agility, all attributes. Increases according to the user's level. When equipped, attacks ignore 100% of all defensive effects. Attacks have a 10% chance of triggering the Soul Devour effect. Attacks have a 50% chance of dealing 500% damage. Attacks cause an additional 100% damage to all creatures below Tier 6, ignore levels plus 60. All attributes increased by 100%, physique increased by 50%, reaction speed increased by 40%. Effects of all attacks increased by 2 ranks, up to Tier 6 peak. The strength of mana increased by 1 rank, concentration increased by 1 rank. Additional passive skill Incinerator's Body, weakens all damage received by 40% and increases world perception by 1 rank. Additional active skill 1, Incinerator's Phantasm, sacrifice 20 levels to summon the phantasm of a player. The phantasm can only be 2 tiers higher than the Shadow Incinerator's wielder. Duration, 3 minutes cooldown, 10 natural days additional active skill to the end, with death as the price, incite all of the Shadow Incinerator's power to deal a devastating blow to a 5,000-yard radius. The stronger the soul sacrificed, the stronger the attack will be, up to Tier 6 peak. The myriad ancient gods have placed 4 seals on the Shadow Incinerator. Wielding the Shadow Incinerator will cause continuous mental scorching. Deaths while wielding the Shadow Incinerator will result in a loss of 50 points in all attributes. A godly relic. Shi Feng was dumbfounded when he saw the Shadow Incinerator's stats. Godly relics were different from other items. They were items that had existed since the birth of God's domain and were not specifically categorized. As a result, godly relics could vary drastically in strength, with stronger ones being superior to even divine artifacts and weaker ones being inferior to even legendary items. However, the Shadow Incinerator was clearly among the top end of godly relics in terms of strength. Despite having 4 seals placed on it, the Shadow Incinerator was still stronger than fragmented legendary weapons. In terms of basic attributes, it was already close to matching legendary equipment. If all of the Shadow Incinerator's seals were removed, he couldn't even begin to imagine how powerful it could become. If Shifeng had to point out a flaw with the Shadow Incinerator, it would have to be the weapon being overly extreme. The active skills that came with the weapon were double-edged weapons that should never be used unless absolutely necessary. Honestly, even using it normally was a huge problem. Currently, Shifeng was experiencing searing pain in his mind just by holding onto the Shadow Incinerator. If he had to fight while suffering through this pain, there was no way he could give the fight his all. However, Shifeng also had to admit that the Shadow Incinerator was truly powerful. In his current state, he could exhibit strength near the Tier 6 standard even through his normal attacks. If he executed a combat technique, he could most certainly exhibit Tier 6 power. While Shifeng was inspecting the carbonized sword in his hand, he suddenly received a series of system notifications. System: you have accepted the Greater Gods Domain's mythical main storyline quest Incinerator's Shadow. Quest content: undo all of the Shadow Incinerator's seals. Rewards unknown. Penalties unknown. System: all ancient gods have become hostile to you. System: you have received the Great Sinner title. As soon as the system notifications ended, the color of Shifeng's ID instantly went from white to black. On top of that, his ID was now surrounded by dark fog, an indicator of his identity as a great sinner. Crap. Isn't this too much? Shifeng couldn't help but curse as he looked at his ID. Dark players who murdered other players all day long could, at most, become a sinner. Even the sin of murdering an ancient empire's emperor would only turn one into a sinner and cause one to be hunted by the NPCs of said empire. In comparison, players who became great sinners would not only be hunted by all NPCs, but even players would be tempted to join in on the hunt. This was because anyone who managed to capture a great sinner could turn the latter into the Adventurers Association for a piece of legendary equipment that had high compatibility with them. To make matters worse, once players became a great sinner, they could never get rid of the title. It was a soulbound title, and it would follow them even if they started a new account. Before Shifeng could swear a few more times, the space above the altar suddenly shattered, revealing a space-time passage. Then, a 20-meter-tall giant emerged from the passage, the giant wearing a white robe that fully hid their appearance. When this giant appeared, Shifeng felt as if a bomb had gone off in his head. Immediately afterward, a tsunami-like divine might, far stronger than even the Shadow Incinerators, spread from the giant. Ancient God, level, HP. Great Sinner Black Flame. Receive the judgment of the gods. Before the giant's furious shout could reverberate across the cavern, the giant summoned an axe of light in their hand and swung it at Shifeng. TL notes: for the Shadow Incinerator's description, note that I have changed additional profound inheritance 1/2 additional active skill 1/2. The roars translate to additional profound skill, which leads me to believe that the author made a typo. If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. Chapter 33:18, Chapter 392, Ancient God's Might. Chapter 33:18, Chapter 392, Ancient God's Might. Chapter 392, Ancient God's Might. Outside the floating island atop the Void Sea, numerous fleets braved the attacks of countless Void Sea Serpents and Void Sea Dragons as they tried to cross the Void Sea. There would be ships sinking and void creatures falling at every moment. The grandeur of the battle was unprecedented in the miniature ancient world. However, rather than the ongoing battle on the sea, the various players fighting on the sea paid more attention to the player army gathered around the floating island. Compared to the player army floating in mid-air around the island, the player army on the sea was nothing but a joke. Is this the Paimon conglomerate's strength? Franz, commander of the Tower Alliance's 6th Trump Card Legion and the Desolate Star Corporation's second successor, was in awe and shock as he looked at the hundreds of thousands of figures hovering next to the floating island. Although the Desolate Star Corporation was considered first-rate among the many corporations in the greater world, its strength in God's domain was nowhere close to matching the Paimon conglomerate. Comparing the Desolate Star Corporation with the Paimon conglomerate would be akin to comparing a candle flame to a forest fire. Despite being second in the Desolate Star Corporation's line of succession, Franz had to go to great lengths to organize a 100-man team of Tier 4 experts. Although many of his team's Tier 4 experts were fourth-floor experts, which made it significantly stronger than the average 100-man Tier 4 team, it was still nothing compared to the forces Dira managed to summon. An army of several 100,000 Tier 4 experts. Although most of these experts were only at the third-floor standard, even if only 1/10 of them were fourth-floor experts, that would still be several tens of thousands of fourth-floor experts. Not to mention, apart from Tier 4 experts, there were also over 1,000 Tier 5 experts in Dira's army. It should be known that these Tier 5 experts weren't instant Tier 5 players. Instead, they were all veteran experts who had previously chosen to stay at Tier 4 because they couldn't create a Tier 5 epic mana body. After closely examining these Tier 5 experts, Franz found over 100 titled experts he recognized. Over 100 Tier 5 titled expert. Although the Desolate Star Corporation had the strength to mobilize such a force, it had to be extremely cautious when doing so. After all, the corporation only had several hundred Tier 5 titled experts under its command. Moreover, these titled experts came from several different hegemonic powers. The corporation couldn't simply mobilize them whenever it wanted. However, it took only Dira, or, more specifically, the Divine Seal Saint, only one word to mobilize all these Tier 5 titled experts. At this time, Favre, standing next to Franz, sighed and said, "We should hurry up and break through these monsters. If we spend too much time here, we might end up getting implicated." Favre wasn't surprised by the sight of the Paimon conglomerate's Tier 4 army since she had seen much grander sights. However, the Divine Seal Saint getting over 1,000 Tier 5 experts into the World Passage was beyond her expectations. The Divine Seal Saint could already launch an invasion into a god's domain with so many Tier 5 experts, let alone the miniature ancient world. "It seems Zero Wing is doomed this time," Death Omen said, sighing ruefully as she looked at the army of Tier 4 and Tier 5 experts in the sky. "It's a pity we won't get to enter the island to look around since Dira doesn't think anything of us." Death Omen couldn't help but grow melancholic when she thought of her current situation. She used to be a Tier 6 expert standing at the pinnacle on the main continent. Yet, after entering the miniature ancient world, she wasn't even qualified to be a part of Dira's army, let alone stand at the miniature ancient world's apex. "Don't worry, Big Sis Omen. It won't be long before I become a core member of Paimon. At that time, we won't even need to care about Dira's opinion," Thousand Scars said, fighting spirit burning in her eyes as she looked at White Owl, who was currently commanding Dira's army. In the past, Thousand Scars thought that becoming an internal member of the Paimon conglomerate was already high enough of a goal. After all, if she became an internal member, even hegemonic powers would take the initiative to curry favor with her. However, after seeing White Owl, Thousand Scars learned that becoming an internal member was far from enough. Only by becoming a core paragon such as White Owl could she truly be considered to have reached the apex of God's domain. Even a young master like Dira would have to keep his arrogance in check when asking White Owl for help. Outside the floating island, over 1,000 level 140, Tier 5 experts orderly gathered in front of White Owl, none daring to step out of line. At this time, a middle-aged male oracle approached White Owl and confidently said, "We've finished sealing the entire island, Commander Owl." Not even a Tier 6 expert should think of escaping easily. Even after hearing the middle-aged oracle's bold claim, none of the Tier 5 experts opened their mouths to refute him. On the contrary, all of them had full faith in his words. Besides being a titled expert, the middle-aged oracle was also a top-tier grandmaster magician. A magic barrier he personally created could easily keep the average Tier 6 expert trapped for half an hour. Moreover, that was only when 500 Tier 4 magical class experts operated the magic barrier. Currently, several dozen Tier 5 experts were responsible for operating the magic barrier the middle-aged oracle had erected around the island. On top of that, they also had the support of over 1,000 Tier 4 magical class experts. In its current state, The magic barrier could easily trap a Tier 6 expert for 2 or 3 hours. Good. White Owl nodded. Once we are inside, all you Tier 5s follow me to kill the 2 experts I mentioned as quickly as possible. As for everyone else, cordon off the town and do not let any of the trial challengers escape. Understood. Upon hearing White Owl's command, everyone drew their weapons and got ready to charge into the floating island with White Owl. Just as White Owl was about to inform Dira about the start of their attack, a white beam suddenly came from the island's depths. Boom. Following the beam, the barrier surrounding the island shattered like glass and vanished. As a result, all the magical class players maintaining it suffered a backlash and died on the spot, their bodies falling into the void sea below. An ambush. Did we get attacked? The experts gathered outside the floating island were stunned by this unexpected development. However, before anyone could make sense of what had happened, a mighty aura spread from the island and exerted overpowering pressure on the players caught within its range. Immediately, the hundreds of thousands of Tier 4 experts hovering next to the island lost their lives and fell into the void sea. As for the Tier 5 experts, although they managed to cling on to their lives, that was all they could do. The pressure exerted by the mighty aura thoroughly paralyzed them. Subsequently, a cloaked swordsman could be seen suddenly flying out of the island. Meanwhile, whether it was White Owl and Dira or Death Omen and Thousand Scars, they instantly recognized the cloaked swordsman when they saw his face. Black Flame. If you find any errors, broken links, non-standard content, etc., please let us know so we can fix it as soon as possible. You're tuning in to the Celestial War YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories,